Pincoffs' last two chapters deal directly with moral education. On page 133, he writes, "The primary aim of moral education is to encourage the development of the right sort of person." In working out what he means by this claim, we will differentiate between moral training and moral indoctrination. Having made this distinction, he will then distinguish between defensible and indefensible forms of the latter. Some of you might want to challenge Pincoffs' claim right at the outset. He wants to develop the right sort of person. If one is of a subjectivist bent, there is no such thing as the right sort of person, and thus, at least on Pincoffs' terms, no such thing as moral education. On such an account, being the right sort of person would be nothing more than whatever the person in question desires to be. Well, perhaps that is a bit hasty. Maybe on the subjectivist account, there is moral education. Maybe for such a person, moral education is simply learning how to be the kind of person one desires to be, whatever kind of person that might be. If I want to be the sort of person who is kind, gracious, and generous, then my moral education would seek to form me into the sort of person who is kind, gracious, and generous. Two problems might arise with this approach. First, I might not know what it means to be kind, gracious, and generous. As a subjectivist, I will feel a lack of trust for other people's definitions of these terms and ways of being insofar as they are not my own definitions. Second, if someone were to ask me why I wanted to be this sort of person, the best answer I could offer, given my subjectivist convictions, was that I wanted to be this sort of person simply because I wanted to be this sort of person. Such a tautological explanation might work amid a community of other subjectivists, but it might not work well with others. As for myself, I'm not a subjectivist. I believe there is, to at least some degree, a right sort of person. I aspire to be that kind of person. My own moral education will require me to learn what I can about what that right sort of person would look like in my setting and context, and then find and take up the practices that would make me that sort of person. Along the way, I will have to do at least two things. I will have to submit myself to others who know more than I do, people who are closer to being the right sort of person than I am. Will also have to learn how to give account of myself, to explain my reasons for acting the way I do, and for aiming to be the sort of person I am becoming. Pincoffs has used the word indoctrination. In these next few pages, he'll be discussing what that is. If you've been in some of the same linguistic communities I have, you may not have heard much positive said about indoctrination. Since autonomous individualism is a major conviction of our age, it's common to look askance at indoctrination as something heteronomous, something imposed on us from without. The ethic of our age demands that we be authentic and free. It is assumed that experiencing indoctrination mitigates against both of these ideals. One place we can look is our experience with our own critique of our own desires. This includes looking backwards at our lives and seeing some desires that were expressed in our way of living as good and others as bad. One story I've heard is of the person who, upon looking back at his life, wished he had worked harder when he was young, so that his current circumstances and opportunities could be better. Another way of doing this is to consider our experience of desiring certain desires. It might be that I recognize the good of getting an education. Recognizing that it would be good for me to receive an education, I then desire that education. Desiring an education is merely the start of the process. We then add to that desires to desire to study, desire to read, desire to learn, desire to write well. Or consider food. Suppose I desire to be a healthy person. I know that being healthy is partly a result of what I eat. I have this desire to be healthy, and a desire to eat a cheeseburger and fries every day, and dessert after every meal. If my desire to be healthy is to be achieved, I will have to change my desires around what I eat. I will start with a desire to desire healthier food. On page 134, we find Pincoffs engaging with the work of philosophers John Wilson and R.M. Hare on indoctrination. As philosophers often do, they start exploring the concept by showing what they don't mean. The first position rejected is that indoctrination is a method of instruction. More reasonable, Wilson thinks, is to find the point of definition as relative to the certainty of the topic at hand. Pincoffs puts Wilson's positions this way. Indoctrination consists in teaching what is uncertain as if it were certain. Education, on the other hand, consists in instructing in such a way that the certainty with which a doctrine is taught is directly related to the publicly acceptable evidence available for its support. Moral beliefs are uncertain, not merely in the sense that there is not enough such evidence for their support, but also in that we are not sure what kind of evidence it takes to support them. That's Pincoffs on Wilson. From what you've read of Pincoffs, I don't think you'd be surprised to notice that he's dubious about Wilson's position. Two assumptions of Wilson trigger Pincoffs' doubts. First, there's the assumption that what is certain is what sane and sensible people would accept. What criteria do we have to identify who counts as sane and sensible? The majority of people in our area? The majority throughout history or in some particular era? The people who agree with us? We can see Pincoffs' second reason for doubt arising here. Wilson's assumption that areas that admit of the certainty in which indoctrination is acceptable are those in which the truth claims are universally available and recognized. Once we confront the substance of Pincoffs' first reason for doubting Wilson, we also see how this desired universality isn't as readily available as he expects. Hare has similar doubts. Pincoffs presents his challenge to Wilson this way. Once we admit Catholics, communists, and Anglicans, and other potential indoctrinators into the fold as sane and sensible, then we have no ground in which to reject their claim that the beliefs they teach are certain, since the criterion of certainty in a belief is that sane and sensible people, when presented with the relevant facts and arguments, necessarily hold it. Hence, we have no grounds for rejecting the inculcation of religious and moral catechisms by whatever means as indoctrination. Pincoffs continues, shifting to where Hare sees the difference between education and indoctrination. In place of method or content, Hare would put aim. Aim is what enables us to distinguish the indoctrinator from the educator. Indoctrination only begins when we are trying to stop the growth in our children of the capacity to think for themselves about moral questions. The aim of the educator is to get the pupil to think for himself. So his method is to discuss moral questions with him. I confess up front that there's something I like about Hare's position. My own teaching practice is, I like to imagine, of the variety that develops the capacity of people to think for themselves rather than to accept my claims uncritically. I also recognize that when I do this, I am, like Hare apparently, smuggling in the assumption that thinking for oneself is morally superior to having one's thinking determined by another. Or to use fancier terms, autonomy is morally superior to heteronomy. When I teach people, in whatever context, to think for themselves because I value their autonomy, can I also teach them to think for themselves about the value of autonomy itself? Can they question the assumption that autonomy itself is a moral value of the highest order, a value that relativizes all others? Can we come to a position where autonomy is recognized as a good, but not the only good? That sometimes thinking for ourselves needs to be ordered relative to other things that we value? On page 136, Pincoffs turns to some possibly non-problematic forms of indoctrination. He says that given the dictionary definition of indoctrination as being imbued with a doctrine, idea, or opinion, we find this activity all over, particularly in cases when we are entering an organization or discipline. Just a brief side note. You've noticed that indoctrination and doctrine share the same root. The usual meaning of this Latin root is simply teaching. The word has in recent times become more limited in applications in its most common usage, but it's useful to remember its origins. As you would imagine, the original sense of a doctor was a teacher. If some indoctrination is acceptable for Pincoffs, are there occasions when it is not? On the next page, he claims that indoctrination is unacceptable when it becomes brainwashing. In this case, the teachers are making it psychologically impossible for a person to deliberate to any purpose about certain matters. In these cases, he says, a problem is that the process is called education, but indoctrination seeks to make the thinking and critical reflection that comes with education impossible. Hare is against the indoctrination that quashes the ability to think for oneself, because however complete the education is, the student will at some point in life encounter new situations. The indoctrinator, or infallible authority, to use another term, will not be available on every occasion to provide all the answers needed. Because we must at some point think for ourselves, learning to do so is a necessary part of the education process. Insofar as indoctrination rules out thinking for ourselves, it keeps that education from being successful. Pincoffs, though sympathetic, isn't content to just accept Hare's argument on this point. On page 140, he considers Hare's use of the concept of principles. His analysis takes us to the question of continuity and change. Hare would have the successful student equipped with principles that allow her to adopt to new situations. But what are these principles? Are any of the principles themselves unchanging? What about the principle that tells us be a moral person? How flexible should the well-educated student be on this principle? Let's consider how Pincoffs advances the discussion beginning on page 144. There he writes, the demand that each person should be free to think for himself is the consequence of his responsibility for the moral beliefs that he holds. When he becomes an adult, he will be held answerable for his wrongdoing. He cannot avoid this responsibility by saying that he did what he did because his parents or his teacher told him to do it. Nor can he appeal to the command of a dictator, the canons of church or state, or laws of the state. If parent, teacher, dictator, church, or state provides him with general principles that he must follow in making decisions, then he invokes these principles in justification of his action. They become his principles, and he is responsible for them too. By accepting them, he signals acceptance of himself as the kind of person who is governed by those principles. If they are attacked, he must defend them. He could have chosen other principles, but he has not done so. Notice here how central responsibility is in this context, because we are responsible for what we do and will be held responsible for what we do. There must be a real sense in which our actions are our actions, not merely the programming installed by others. Notice also that autonomous individualism is assumed not to be the deepest truth about us. We live in community with others. The communities in which we live call us to account for our actions. Because we are responsible to them, we have the responsibility to ourselves to learn how to give an account of our actions in terms of more than just desire. The I want is a real part of our lives. Because we live in community, however, it is relativized by the sense that there is a common good, a set of features that describe the good for us together. We might call this a Kantian insight, that if everyone were to live only by the demands of their own desire, if the I want was the highest authority, then our community simply would not work. Pincoffs sustains this argument on page 145, pushing us toward the role that responsible thinking for ourselves takes. He writes, this ultimate responsibility, not just for his actions, but also for being the kind of person that he is as revealed by the kinds of reasons or principles he cites in justification of his actions is what makes it morally mandatory that the pupil should be educated in such a way that he can think for himself. He wants to become an adult for the very good reason that he will be treated as an adult. To shove him into the world an eternal child is morally unjustifiable. The bottom of that page, Pincoffs identifies some features of this good education that he's imagining. He writes, the individual who has had a good moral education will not only give and be guided by the right reasons, he will have the right instincts, the right reactions. This is the result not of indoctrination, but of training. Can you think of an activity you're involved in where instincts and reactions are important? I know many of you are involved in athletics. Are instincts and reactions important in your sports? As you progress in those sports, do you notice how your instincts and reactions are honed and sharpened? The idea is that the better your instincts and reactions, the better you'll be at playing the game. And we do have a clear sense here that some instincts and some reactions, in sports at least, are better than others. Pincoffs' thought is that training and sharpening our instincts, our reactions and instincts in the moral realm will make us better at playing in our communities, that we will be able to do ethics better. He closes this line of thought on page 148. He writes, far from closing the mind, moral training provides it with the fundamental considerations against which moral beliefs may be tested. It makes it possible for children to think for themselves. With moral training and consequently with a developing moral character, they are able to evaluate the doctrines and principles, the beliefs that are proposed to them. In this course, we've covered several ethical theories. It's helpful to think deeply about what education into each of these theories looks like. If, for example, I am to be an egoist, believing that I ought to pursue my own self-interest, how do I become good at this? What kind of anthropology is required for me to be an egoist? What must I believe about individualism and the possible significance of living in community? What does it look like to be accountable to and to offer accounts of my behavior to others when I'm supposed to be pursuing my own self-interest? If I am an egoist, how do I hold others accountable? Do I have no option other than a resigned, well, I guess she thought that was in her own self-interest? Could the role of accountability in an egoist community be calling me to be able to give a better account of what is truly in my own self-interest and not merely apparently so?